long before the Stars and Stripes flew over any battlefield, long before the Constitution was drafted or the Declaration signed, long before any European ship broke the horizon of the Atlantic, this land was alive. It was alive with the songs of over 500 distinct nations, with trade routes stretching thousands of miles, with cities, real cities that rivaled anything in medieval Europe. The story of the United States doesn't begin in 1776. It doesn't begin in 1492. It begins thousands of years before that. And to understand where America is going, you need to understand where it truly started. This is the complete history of the United States of America, from its first peoples to its rise as the most powerful nation the world has ever seen. And it is a story of triumph and tragedy, of idealism and hypocrisy, of reinvention and reckoning, all woven into one extraordinary, complicated, unfinished narrative. Let's begin. At least 15,000 years ago, and possibly much earlier, the first humans set foot on what we now call the Americas. Most scholars believe they crossed a land bridge called Beringia, a stretch of land that once connected Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. But that's not the only theory. Some researchers now believe that early peoples may have also traveled along the Pacific coastline by boat, hugging the shoreline in small watercraft, hopping from inlet to inlet, long before anyone walked across the interior. However they arrived, these first Americans didn't find an empty wilderness. They found a continent of staggering ecological richness, vast forests, endless grasslands, fertile river valleys, and coastlines teeming with life. And over thousands of years, they didn't just survive here, they built civilizations. Consider this. Around the year 1100 AD, the city of Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, Missouri, had a population of perhaps 20,000 people. That made it larger than London at the same time. Cahokia's central mound, Monk's Mound, is the largest earthen structure in the Americas, 100 feet tall, covering 14 acres at its base. This was not a primitive settlement. This was a planned urban center with plazas, residential neighborhoods, and astronomical alignments. In the southwest, the ancestral Puebloans, sometimes called the Anasazi, constructed extraordinary cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde and built the massive complex at Chaco Canyon, with buildings of over 600 rooms connected by a network of roads stretching across the desert. In the northeast, the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, developed one of the world's earliest examples of representative democracy. 5, and later 6, nations came together under the Great Law of Peace, a constitution that governed through consensus, protected individual rights, and distributed power among councils. Some historians believe it influenced the framers of the United States Constitution. The Haudenosaunee themselves have no doubt about it. Across the continent, from the salmon-fishing nations of the Pacific Northwest to the buffalo-hunting peoples of the Great Plains, to the agricultural societies of the Southeast, hundreds of distinct cultures flourished. They spoke hundreds of languages, they had their own religions, their own laws, their own art, their own science. Estimates of the indigenous population of North America before European contact vary widely, but many scholars now place the number between 5 and 15 million people. Some estimates go even higher. These were not primitive people waiting to be discovered. They were complex societies with deep histories and rich traditions. They had been here for millennia. But by the late 1400s, far across the Atlantic, a restless continent was looking westward. Europe, fresh from the Crusades, hungry for trade routes, armed with gunpowder and steel, and a particular strain of religious certainty was about to collide with this world. And when it did, the consequences would be catastrophic beyond anything either side could have imagined. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator sailing under the Spanish flag, crossed the Atlantic and made landfall in the Bahamas. He was looking for a shortcut to Asia. He found something else entirely. Columbus never set foot on the North American mainland. But his voyages opened the floodgates. Within decades, Spanish conquistadors were pushing into Florida, the Gulf Coast, and the American Southwest. They came looking for gold, for glory, and for souls to convert. They established missions, presidios, and a colonial system built on the exploitation of indigenous labor. The French came too, exploring the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and eventually the entire Mississippi River basin. They built a fur-trading empire, forming alliances with indigenous nations, alliances that were strategic, often mutually beneficial, but always shaped by European ambitions. But the most devastating weapon the Europeans brought was invisible. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity. The result was biological apocalypse. In some regions, entire communities were wiped out before they ever saw a European face. Epidemics raced ahead of the colonizers themselves, traveling along the very trade networks that had connected indigenous nations for centuries. Estimates suggest that up to 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas may have perished within the first century of contact. 90%. It is one of the greatest demographic catastrophes in human history, and it reshaped the continent before colonization had even truly begun. England was late to the colonization race, but when it arrived, it came to stay. In 1607, a group of English settlers established Jamestown in present-day Virginia. It was a disaster from the start. The settlers were ill-prepared, many were gentlemen who had never worked with their hands. They chose a swampy, mosquito-infested site. Within the first year, disease, starvation, and conflict with the local Powhatan Confederacy killed the majority of them. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, the starving time, some resorted to cannibalism. Archaeological evidence has confirmed it. Jamestown survived, barely. What saved it was tobacco, a cash crop that created enormous profits and enormous demand for labor. That demand would soon be met, in part, by enslaved Africans. In 1619, the first recorded Africans arrived in Virginia. They were not the last. A system was taking root that would define and haunt America for centuries. Meanwhile, in 1620, a group of religious separatists we call the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in present-day Massachusetts. They signed the Mayflower Compact, a remarkable document in which the settlers agreed to govern themselves by majority rule. It was a small step, but it was a step toward self-governance that would echo through American history. A decade later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony brought thousands more English Puritans to New England. They came not for gold, but for God, to build what their leader, John Winthrop, called a city upon a hill. That phrase, that idea of America as a model for the world, has never gone away. By the mid-1600s, England had established 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard, and they were far from uniform. In New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, life revolved around religion, small farms, fishing, and trade. Town meetings provided a direct form of democracy. Education mattered. Harvard College was founded in 1636, just 6 years after the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, were the most diverse. Pennsylvania, founded by the Quaker William Penn, was a haven of religious tolerance. New York, originally the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, was a commercial hub from the start. These colonies were a patchwork of ethnicities, languages, and faiths. The southern colonies, Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, Georgia, developed a very different character. Large plantations growing tobacco, rice, and indigo dominated the economy, and that economy ran on enslaved labor. By the early 1700s, slavery was not a sideshow in the southern economy, it was the economy. The transatlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, was one of history's greatest horrors. Millions of Africans were kidnapped, chained in the holds of ships, and transported across the ocean under conditions so brutal that hundreds of thousands died in transit. Those who survived were sold as property, denied their names, their languages, their families, their humanity, and from their suffering, colonial America built its wealth. As the colonies grew, so did conflict. The colonists clashed repeatedly with indigenous nations who were being displaced from their lands. King Philip's War, which raged across New England from 1675 to 1676, was proportional to population one of the deadliest wars in American history. It ended with the near destruction of several indigenous nations in the region. But the conflict that reshaped the continent was the French and Indian War, the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War, fought from 1754 to 1763. Britain and its colonial allies fought France and its indigenous allies for control of the continent. Britain won. France ceded virtually all of its North American territory. It was a stunning victory. But it came at a staggering cost. Britain was drowning in war debt, and it looked across the Atlantic at 13 prosperous colonies and thought they should help pay for this. That decision, that impulse to tax the colonies, would set off a chain of events that no one could stop. In 1763, King George III issued the Royal Proclamation forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. To the colonists, this was outrageous. They had just fought a war to open that land. Now they were being told they couldn't have it. The first crack in the relationship between Britain and its American colonies had appeared. It would only widen. The British government needed revenue. The colonies, at reason, should bear some of the cost of their own defense. What followed was a cascade of taxes and regulations that the colonists found intolerable, not because the amounts were ruinous, but because they had no voice in the process. The Stamp Act of 1,765 taxed newspapers, legal documents, playing cards, nearly every printed piece of paper in the colonies. The response was furious. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. The act was repealed, but Parliament immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Then came the Townshend Acts of 1767, taxing imported goods like glass, lead, paint, and tea. Colonists organized boycotts. Tensions escalated. British troops were sent to Boston to keep order. On the 5th of March, 1770, a confrontation between a crowd of colonists and a squad of British soldiers turned deadly. 5 colonists were killed. The event was immediately dubbed the Boston Massacre, and it became a propaganda weapon. Paul Revere's famous engraving of the scene, widely circulated, depicted a line of soldiers firing into a helpless crowd. It wasn't entirely accurate, but it was effective. The most audacious act of defiance came on the 16th of December, 1773. Angry over the Tea Act, which gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales, a group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the process. Water. The Boston Tea Party was an act of economic sabotage and symbolic rebellion. It electrified the colonies. Britain's response was swift and severe. Parliament passed what the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, closing Boston Harbor, revoking Massachusetts's charter, and allowing British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England rather than in the colonies. The message was clear: submit or be crushed. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of isolating Massachusetts, the Intolerable Acts united the colonies. In September 1774, delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They demanded their rights as British subjects, they organized resistance, and they began to prepare for the possibility of war. War came on the 19th of April, 1775. British General Thomas Gage sent 700 troops from Boston to seize colonial weapons stockpiled at Concord, Massachusetts. Riders, including Paul Revere, fanned out through the night to warn the countryside. At Lexington, a small band of colonial militiamen, Minutemen, they were called, stood on the village green as the British column approached. Someone fired a shot. To this day, no one knows who. Within seconds, the British soldiers unleashed a volley. 8 Americans lay dead. The British marched on to Concord. But this time, the colonists were ready at the North Bridge. Minutemen fired on British troops and forced them to retreat. And as the Redcoats marched back to Boston, they were harassed by colonial fighters firing from behind trees, stone walls, and farmhouses. By the time the bloodied British column reached the safety of Boston, 73 of their soldiers were dead and 174 were wounded. The American Revolution had begun. In May 1775, the Second Continental Congress convened. They appointed George Washington, a Virginia planter and experienced military officer, as commander of the Continental Army. But even then, many delegates still hoped for reconciliation with Britain. What changed minds was a 47-page pamphlet. In January 1776, Thomas Paine published Times Common Sense. In plain, fiery language, Paine argued that monarchy itself was absurd, that the colonies owed nothing to Britain, and that independence was not only justified but inevitable. The pamphlet sold over 500,000 copies in a colonial population of roughly 2.5 million. Proportionally, it would be like a book selling 60 million copies in America today. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, drafted primarily by Thomas Jefferson. Its opening words became the most famous expression of human rights ever written. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These words were revolutionary. They were also, in 1776, profoundly hypocritical. Jefferson himself enslaved over 600 people during his lifetime. The Declaration said nothing about women. It said nothing about indigenous peoples except to denounce them. The gap between American ideals and American reality was present at the very beginning. It has never fully closed. But the Declaration did something extraordinary. It articulated a standard, a promise, an aspiration that future generations would hold the nation accountable to again and again and again. The war itself was long, brutal, and, for the Americans, nearly lost many times over. George Washington's army was outgunned, outnumbered, undertrained, and underfunded. Against him stood the most powerful military force on earth, the British Army and the Royal Navy. The early years were grim. Washington lost New York. He retreated across New Jersey. By December 1776, the revolution seemed on the verge of collapse. Then, on Christmas night, Washington crossed the icy Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on Hessian troops at Trenton. It was a small victory militarily, but an enormous one psychologically. The revolution survived. The turning point came in October 1777, when American forces defeated a British army at Saratoga, New York. The victory convinced France, eager to weaken its old rival, Britain, to enter the war on America's side. French money, French weapons, French ships, and French soldiers would prove decisive. But first, there was the winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Washington's army, starving, freezing, decimated by disease, endured one of the most harrowing ordeals in American military history. Over 2,000 soldiers died that winter. But those who survived emerged as a hardened, disciplined fighting force, drilled by the Prussian officer Baron von Steuben. The war dragged on for years. It was fought in the north, in the south, on the frontier, and at sea. Thousands of enslaved people fled to British lines, seeking the freedom that the Americans denied them. Indigenous nations, most of whom allied with Britain, correctly perceiving that American independence would mean the theft of their lands, fought on the frontier with devastating effectiveness. The end came at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. A combined American and French force, supported by the French fleet, trapped British General Cornwallis. After weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. When the news reached London, the British Prime Minister reportedly said, "Oh God, it is all over." The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, from the Great Lakes to Spanish Florida. Against all odds, a collection of colonies had defeated an empire. But winning the war was only the beginning. Now came the harder question. What kind of nation would this be? The first attempt at government, the Articles of Confederation, was a failure. It created a central government so weak it couldn't levy taxes, regulate commerce, or maintain a credible military. States quarreled with each other. The economy faltered. In 1786, Shays' Rebellion, an uprising of indebted farmers in Massachusetts, terrified the political class and underscored the need for a stronger government. In the summer of 1787, 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. Over 4 sweltering months, they argued, negotiated, and compromised their way to one of the most remarkable documents in human history, the United States Constitution. It wasn't perfect. The 3/5 compromise, counting each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person for purposes of representation, embedded slavery into the nation's founding charter. The Constitution did not abolish slavery. It did not grant women the right to vote. It was, as the historian Joseph Ellis has written, a bundle of compromises. But it created a framework, a system of checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism that was flexible enough to evolve. And crucially, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, ratified in 1791, guaranteed fundamental freedoms: speech, religion, press, assembly, the right to bear arms, protection against unreasonable search and seizure. In April 1789, George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States in New York City. He was the indispensable man, the one figure trusted by virtually everyone. He served 2 terms and then, in an act that stunned the world, voluntarily stepped down. King George III reportedly said that if Washington gave up power, he would be the greatest man in the world. The great experiment in self-governance was underway. Almost immediately, Americans began to disagree about what their new nation should be. Alexander Hamilton, Washington's Secretary of the Treasury, envisioned a strong central government, a national bank, and an economy driven by industry and commerce. Thomas Jefferson, the Secretary of State, wanted a nation of independent farmers, with power kept close to the states and the people. This debate, centralized power versus decentralized power, industry versus agriculture, elite governance versus popular democracy, would define American politics for generations. It gave birth to the first political parties, Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. In 1800, Jefferson defeated the incumbent John Adams in a bitterly fought presidential election. It was a moment of profound significance, not because Jefferson won, but because Adams peacefully handed over power. No armies marched, no shots were fired. The peaceful transfer of power, something we now take for granted, was, at the time, almost unprecedented in human history. In 1803, Jefferson made the deal of the millennium. Napoleon Bonaparte, desperate for cash to fund his European wars, offered to sell France's vast Louisiana territory, over 828,000 square miles stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. Jefferson bought it for $15 million. Roughly 4 cents per acre. Overnight, the United States doubled in size. To explore this new territory, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on a 2-year expedition to the Pacific. Guided by the Shoshone woman Sacagawea, they mapped, documented, and opened the West to American ambition. What they found was breathtaking. What their journey set in motion, the relentless westward expansion that would displace and destroy indigenous nations, was devastating. The young republic also faced threats from abroad. The War of 1812 fought against Britain over maritime rights, trade restrictions, and British support for indigenous resistance nearly ended in disaster. The British burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. But American victories, especially Andrew Jackson's triumph at the Battle of New Orleans, boosted national pride and cemented a growing sense of American identity. By the 1830s and 1840s, a powerful idea had taken hold of the American imagination. It was called manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined by God and by history to expand across the entire North American continent. It was a seductive idea. It was also a brutal one. For indigenous peoples, manifest destiny meant annihilation. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral homelands in the Southeast to designated Indian Territory west of the Mississippi, present-day Oklahoma. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations, the so-called 5 civilized tribes, were rounded up and marched westward on what became known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died of exposure, disease, and starvation along the way. The Cherokee alone lost an estimated 4,000 people, roughly 1/4 of their entire population. It was ethnic cleansing, carried out by a democratic government under the rule of law. That is a contradiction the United States has never fully reckoned with. Meanwhile, the nation kept expanding. In 1845, the United States annexed the Republic of Texas, which had declared independence from Mexico in 1836. Mexico disputed the annexation, and in 1846, war broke out. The Mexican-American War was swift and decisive. By 1848, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexico ceded an enormous swath of territory, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The United States had taken roughly half of Mexico's land. In 1848, gold was discovered at Sutter's Mill in California. The gold rush of 1849 drew hundreds of thousands of people from around the world. San Francisco, almost overnight, went from a sleepy village to a booming city. California entered the Union as a state in 1850. With the Oregon Territory secured through negotiation with Britain, the United States now stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The dream of manifest destiny from sea to shining sea was realized. But the expansion brought with it a question that could no longer be avoided. Would these new territories allow slavery or not? Slavery was America's original sin, and by the mid-1800s, it was tearing the country apart. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had drawn a line across the map. Slavery would be permitted south of the 36 degrees 30 parallel and prohibited north of it. It was a temporary fix. Everyone knew it. The abolitionist movement was growing in strength and moral urgency. Frederick Douglass, a man who had escaped slavery and become one of the most powerful orators and writers in American history, traveled the country and the world, making the case that slavery was an abomination. Harriet Tubman, who had also escaped slavery, returned to the South again and again at extraordinary personal risk to guide others to freedom through the Underground Railroad, a secret network of safe houses and allies. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Time's Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel depicting the horrors of slavery. It became the best-selling novel of the 19th century and inflamed public opinion in the North. When Abraham Lincoln reportedly met Stowe during the Civil War, he is said to have remarked, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." The Compromise of 1850 tried again to hold the nation together. California entered as a free state. In exchange, the South got the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. The law enraged the North and radicalized moderates. Then came the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which overturned the Missouri Compromise and allowed settlers in new territories to decide the slavery question for themselves, popular sovereignty. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a miniature civil war in which pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers murdered each other in a preview of the larger conflict to come. In 1857, the Supreme Court handed down the Dred Scott decision, ruling that enslaved people were not citizens, had no right to sue in federal court, and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories. The ruling was meant to settle the issue. Instead, it poured gasoline on the fire. In 1859, the radical abolitionist John Brown led a raid on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, hoping to spark a massive slave uprising. He was captured, tried, and hanged. To the South, he was a terrorist. To much of the North, he was a martyr. And then came the election of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, a lanky, self-educated lawyer from Illinois, won the presidency on a platform of preventing the expansion of slavery into new territories. He did not call for abolition where slavery already existed, but for the South, his election was the final provocation. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states. He won without a single electoral vote from the South. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union. By February 1861, 6 more states had followed. The Confederate States of America was born, with Jefferson Davis as its president. The United States of America was breaking apart. At 4:30 in the morning on the 12th of April, 1861, Confederate batteries opened fire on Fort Sumter, a federal garrison in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina. After 34 hours of bombardment, the fort surrendered. Remarkably, no one was killed in the battle itself. But the killing was about to begin on a scale that no one imagined. 4 more states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, seceded after Fort Sumter. 11 states now made up the Confederacy. The border states Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware teetered but stayed in the Union, in some cases only because of federal military pressure. On paper, the Union held enormous advantages. It had a population of 22 million, compared to the Confederacy's 9 million, of whom nearly 4 million were enslaved. The North had the vast majority of the nation's factories, railroads, and financial resources. It had a navy. The South had almost none of these things. But the Confederacy had advantages of its own. It was fighting a defensive war on its own territory. Its soldiers were, on average, better horsemen and better marksmen, and it had, at least initially, superior military leadership, most notably Robert E. Lee, perhaps the finest tactical commander of his generation. The first major battle, Bull Run, in July 1861, just 30 miles from Washington, shattered any illusions that the war would be quick. Civilians from the capital had actually brought picnic baskets to watch what they expected to be a brief, decisive Union victory. Instead, the Union Army was routed. Soldiers and spectators fled back to Washington in chaos. The war would last 4 years. It would be fought in over 10,000 engagements across a continent, and it would be unspeakably brutal. The Battle of Antietam, on the 17th of September, 1862, remains the bloodiest single day in American history. In 12 hours of fighting in the fields and sunken roads of western Maryland, roughly 23,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. 23,000 in a single day. Antietam was a tactical draw, but it was a strategic Union victory, and it gave Lincoln the political opening he needed. On the 1st of January, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were forever free. The proclamation did not immediately free anyone. It applied only to areas the Union did not control. But it transformed the war. What had begun as a fight to preserve the Union was now, explicitly, a war to end slavery. The proclamation also opened the door for African Americans to serve in the Union Army. Over 180,000 black soldiers served during the war, fighting in segregated units with extraordinary valor. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first black regiments, led a courageous assault on Fort Wagner in South Carolina in July 1863. Nearly half the regiment was killed or wounded, including its white commander, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Their sacrifice helped change the way white Americans saw black soldiers and black Americans. The war's turning point came in July 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Over 3 days, Lee's army and the Union Army of the Potomac fought the largest battle ever waged in the Western Hemisphere. Lee's final gamble, Pickett's Charge, a massive frontal assault across open ground, was a catastrophic failure. The Confederates suffered devastating losses and retreated to Virginia. Lee would never invade the North again. Simultaneously, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi, giving the Union control of the entire Mississippi River and splitting the Confederacy in two. From that point, the war became a grinding war of attrition. Grant, now commanding all Union forces, pursued Lee relentlessly through Virginia. William Tecumseh Sherman marched his army from Atlanta to the sea, cutting a path of destruction 60 miles wide through Georgia and then turning north through the Carolinas. Sherman's total war strategy, destroying not just armies but the economic infrastructure that sustained them, broke the Confederacy's will and ability to fight. The human cost was staggering. Between 620,000 and 750,000 Americans died more than in all other American wars combined until Vietnam. Entire communities were devastated. A generation of young men was hollowed out. The landscape of the South was shattered. On the 9th of April, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. Grant's terms were generous. Confederate soldiers could go home, keep their horses, and would not be prosecuted for treason. Lee accepted. The war was over, the Union was preserved, slavery was dead. 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of the 14th of April, 1865, Abraham Lincoln attended a play at Ford's Theater in Washington. Shortly after 10 o'clock, the actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. Lincoln died the next morning. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, standing at Lincoln's bedside, reportedly said, "Now he belongs to the ages." Lincoln's death robbed the nation of the one leader who might have guided it through the aftermath of the war with both firmness and compassion. What followed instead was Reconstruction, the most ambitious and ultimately most tragic chapter in American race relations before the Civil Rights era. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery everywhere in the United States. The 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law to all persons born in the United States. The 15th Amendment, 1870, prohibited denying the right to vote based on race. For a brief, remarkable period, the promise of these amendments was partially realized. Black men voted in enormous numbers. African Americans were elected to state legislatures, to Congress, and to other offices throughout the South. Schools were built, churches flourished. A people who had been held in bondage for 250 years began to build lives of dignity and freedom, but the backlash was ferocious. White supremacist organizations, most notoriously the Ku Klux Klan, waged a campaign of terror. Lynchings, beatings, arson, voter intimidation. Southern state governments passed black codes laws designed to restrict the freedom of formerly enslaved people and force them into a system of labor that looked remarkably like slavery by another name. The North, exhausted by war and increasingly indifferent to the plight of black Americans, gradually withdrew its support for Reconstruction. The Compromise of 1877, which resolved the disputed presidential election of 1876, effectively ended Reconstruction in exchange for the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes gaining the presidency. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South. What followed was the rise of Jim Crow, a system of racial segregation, disenfranchisement, and terror that would endure for nearly a century. The promises of the Reconstruction Amendments were not repealed. They were simply ignored. The Civil War had ended slavery, but the fight for true equality was only beginning. In the decades after the Civil War, the United States transformed itself from an agrarian republic into an industrial colossus. The speed and scale of this transformation were unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Transcontinental Railroad, completed in 1869 at Promontory Summit, Utah, linked the Atlantic to the Pacific by rail. It was an engineering marvel, and it was built on the backs of immigrant laborers, particularly Chinese workers who endured dangerous conditions, discrimination, and in some cases, death. The railroad shrank the continent, opened the West to settlement, and created a truly national market. A new class of industrialists, titans, some called them, robber barons, others said amassed fortunes that dwarfed anything America had previously seen. Andrew Carnegie dominated the steel industry. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil into a monopoly that controlled over 90% of American oil refining. J.P. Morgan commanded the world of finance with an authority that rivaled the federal government itself. Mark Twain gave this era its name, the Gilded Age. Gilded meaning covered in a thin layer of gold over something base and cheap. The metaphor was apt. Beneath the glittering wealth of the few lay the grinding poverty of the many. Workers toiled 12, 14, 16 hours a day in factories, mills, and mines. Children as young as 5 worked in textile mills and coal breakers. Working conditions were dangerous, wages were low, and the gap between rich and poor was a chasm. Millions of immigrants poured into the country, seeking opportunity. Between 1880 and 1920, over 20 million people arrived from Ireland, Italy, Poland, Russia, China, Japan, Mexico, and dozens of other nations. They passed through Ellis Island, they crowded into tenement apartments on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, they built the railroads and mined the coal and staffed the factories that powered America's rise. They were not always welcomed. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the first federal law to restrict immigration based on nationality. Nativist movements targeted Catholics, Jews, and anyone who seemed foreign. The labor movement fought back against exploitation. The Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, and later the Industrial Workers of the World organized strikes, demanded better wages, and sometimes paid with their lives. The Haymarket Affair in Chicago, 1886, the Homestead Strike, 1892, the Pullman Strike, 1894. These were battles, sometimes literally, between workers and the forces of capital. By the end of the 19th century, the United States had conquered a continent. Now it began to look beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War of 1898 was brief, lasting only a few months, but its consequences were enormous. Sparked by the mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor and fueled by sensationalist yellow journalism, the war resulted in a swift American victory. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba gained nominal independence under heavy American influence. The United States had acquired an overseas empire. It was a controversial step. Anti-imperialists, including Mark Twain and Andrew Carnegie, argued that colonialism betrayed American values. Supporters argued that it was America's duty and destiny to spread civilization and democracy. Hawaii, which had been effectively taken over by American sugar planters who overthrew the Hawaiian monarchy in 1893, was formally annexed in 1898. President Theodore Roosevelt, who took office in 1901 after the assassination of William McKinley, embodied America's new assertiveness. His foreign policy motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," signaled that the United States was prepared to use military force to protect its interests. Roosevelt brokered the construction of the Panama Canal, completed in 1914, which connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans and gave the United States unrivaled strategic and commercial power. The excesses of the Gilded Age eventually produced a powerful reform movement, the Progressive Era. Investigative journalists, known as muckrackers, exposed corruption and injustice. Upton Sinclair's Times, The Jungle Times 1906, revealed the horrifying conditions in the meatpacking industry and led to the Pure Food and Drug Act. Ida Tarbell's expose of Standard Oil helped break up Rockefeller's monopoly. Lincoln Steffens documented the corruption of city governments across America. Theodore Roosevelt championed trust-busting, breaking up the monopolies that controlled entire industries. He established national parks and forests, laying the foundation for the conservation movement. His successor, William Howard Taft, and then Woodrow Wilson continued the progressive agenda. The most transformative achievement of the Progressive Era was women's suffrage. For decades, women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and later Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt had fought for the right to vote. They were mocked, arrested, imprisoned, and force-fed during hunger strikes, but they did not stop. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, guaranteeing women the right to vote. It had taken over 70 years of sustained activism. America was changing, growing more powerful, more complex, and more connected to the world beyond its borders. And the world was about to demand America's attention in the most violent way imaginable. When war erupted in Europe in August 1914, most Americans wanted nothing to do with it. President Woodrow Wilson declared neutrality. America would trade with both sides and stay out of the fight, but neutrality became increasingly difficult. German submarine warfare, U-boats sinking merchant and passenger ships outraged American public opinion. The sinking of the British liner RMS Lusitania in May 1915, killing 1,198 people, including 128 Americans, was a turning point in public sentiment, though the U.S. would not enter the war for another 2 years. The final provocation came in early 1917 when British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, a secret German message proposing a military alliance with Mexico against the United States. Combined with the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, it was too much. On the 6th of April 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. Over 2 million American soldiers, the Doughboys, were deployed to France. Their arrival tipped the balance. By November 1918, Germany surrendered. The war had killed over 116,000 Americans, but the losses for Europe were almost incomprehensibly worse. Over 16 million dead across the continent. President Wilson traveled to Paris with a vision for a new world order. His 14 points centered on the idea of a League of Nations that would prevent future wars. But the Treaty of Versailles was harsher than Wilson wanted, and the United States Senate, wary of foreign entanglements, refused to ratify it. America would not join the League of Nations. The rejection was a bitter blow to Wilson and a fateful decision for the world. At home, the 1920s roared, the economy boomed. Jazz music, the Harlem Renaissance, flappers, automobiles, radios, and movies transformed American culture. Prohibition, the ban on alcohol, enacted through the 18th Amendment in 1919, was widely ignored and fueled the rise of organized crime. It was a decade of exuberance, innovation, and willful blindness to the economic fragility underneath. The party ended on the 29th of October 1929, Black Tuesday. The stock market crashed, wiping out millions of investors. But the crash was a symptom, not the cause. The real problems were deeper: overproduction, underconsumption, reckless speculation, a fragile banking system, and profound inequality. The Great Depression that followed was the worst economic catastrophe in American history. By 1933, unemployment had reached 25%, over 9,000 banks had failed, families lost their homes, their savings, their livelihoods, bread lines stretched around city blocks, shantytowns bitterly called Hoovervilles after the president who seemed helpless to stop the crisis sprang up across the country. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt won the presidency in a landslide, promising a New Deal for the American people. And he delivered not a single program, but a blizzard of legislation and executive action that fundamentally redefined the relationship between the federal government and its citizens. The New Deal created Social Security, providing a safety net for the elderly and disabled. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work in national parks and forests. The Works Progress Administration employed millions building roads, bridges, schools, and public buildings. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation protected bank deposits. The Securities and Exchange Commission regulated Wall Street. Not everything worked. The Depression did not truly end until World War II, and the New Deal had significant blind spots. Many programs excluded African Americans and women. But Roosevelt's New Deal established the principle that the federal government had a responsibility to protect its citizens from the worst ravages of economic catastrophe. That principle, embraced or contested, has shaped American politics ever since. While America struggled through the Depression, the world was sliding toward another war. Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany. Imperial Japan expanded aggressively across Asia. Fascism was on the march. Most Americans, scarred by the First World War, wanted to stay out of it. Congress passed Neutrality Acts. The America First movement attracted millions of supporters. Roosevelt, who understood the threat, provided material support to Britain and China through programs like Lend-Lease, but stopped short of direct military involvement. That changed at 7:55 on the morning of the 7th of December 1941. Japanese warplanes launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were killed, 1,178 were wounded, and much of the Pacific Fleet was damaged or destroyed. The next day, Roosevelt addressed Congress and the nation. Yesterday, the 7th of December, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. Congress declared war. Within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. America was now fighting a two-front war in Europe and the Pacific on a scale that dwarfed anything in its history. The American war machine mobilized with breathtaking speed. Factories that had been building cars began building tanks, planes, and ships. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter. Over 16 million Americans served in the armed forces, but the war also exposed America's darker impulses. In February 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them U.S. citizens, in camps across the western United States. They had committed no crime. They were imprisoned solely because of their ancestry. It was one of the gravest violations of civil liberties in American history. In Europe, American forces joined the Allied invasion of North Africa, then Sicily and Italy, and then, on the 6th of June 1944, the beaches of Normandy. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, broke the Nazi grip on Western Europe. Over 4,400 Allied soldiers died on that single day. The liberation of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands followed. In April 1945, Allied forces entered Germany. Hitler committed suicide on April 30. Germany surrendered on May 8, VE Day. In the Pacific, the war was fought island by island in some of the most brutal combat of the entire conflict. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Guadalcanal names seared into American memory. As the Allies closed in on Japan, American military planners faced a grim calculus. An invasion of the Japanese mainland could cost hundreds of thousands of American lives and millions of Japanese lives. President Harry Truman Roosevelt had died in April 1945, made the most consequential decision of the 20th century. On the 6th of August 1945, an American B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The explosion killed approximately 80,000 people instantly. Tens of thousands more died from radiation and injuries in the weeks and months that followed. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing approximately 40,000 people instantly. Japan surrendered on August 15. The debate over whether the atomic bombings were justified has never ended. What is undeniable is that they ushered humanity into the nuclear age, an age in which, for the first time, our species had the power to destroy itself. World War II killed over 400,000 Americans. Globally, the death toll was staggering, an estimated 70 to 85 million people, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. But America emerged from the war not weakened, but stronger than any nation had ever been. Its factories were intact, its economy was booming, it possessed the atomic bomb. It was, by any measure, the most powerful country on Earth. The American century had begun. The alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union had been one of necessity. With the common enemy defeated, it collapsed almost immediately. The two superpowers represented fundamentally incompatible visions of the world. The United States championed capitalism, individual liberty, and democratic governance, at least in principle. The Soviet Union championed communism, collective ownership, and one-party rule. Each side believed the other represented an existential threat to humanity. Winston Churchill described the division of Europe in a speech in 1946. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain, the Soviet Union imposed communist governments on Eastern Europe. The United States responded with the Truman Doctrine, pledging to support free peoples resisting communist takeover, and the Marshall Plan, which poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe, both as humanitarian aid and as a bulwark against Soviet influence. The Cold War was fought everywhere except directly between the two superpowers. In Korea, from 1950 to 1953, over 36,000 Americans died in a brutal war that ended in a stalemate and a divided peninsula that remains divided to this day. At home, the fear of communism reached hysterical proportions. Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin conducted a years-long campaign of accusation and intimidation, claiming that communists had infiltrated the government, the military, Hollywood, and virtually every institution. Lives and careers were destroyed on the basis of rumor, innuendo, and guilt by association. McCarthyism eventually burned itself out. McCarthy was censured by the Senate in 1954, but the damage to civil liberties and public trust was significant. The Cold War's most terrifying dimension was the nuclear arms race. By 1949, the Soviet Union had its own atomic bomb. Both sides rapidly built arsenals capable of destroying civilization many times over. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in schools. The threat of nuclear annihilation, mutually assured destruction, aptly shortened to MAD, hung over everything. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than at any other time. The Cuban Missile Crisis, triggered by the discovery of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, brought the United States and the Soviet Union to the brink. For 13 days, President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a terrifying diplomatic standoff. In the end, the Soviets withdrew the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. It was the closest humanity has ever come to self-annihilation. The Cold War's longest and most divisive chapter for Americans was Vietnam. The United States gradually escalated its involvement in a civil war in Southeast Asia, seeking to prevent Communist North Vietnam from taking over the South. What began with military advisors in the 1950s became a full-scale war by the mid-1960s, with over 500,000 American troops deployed at the peak. The Vietnam War was broadcast into American living rooms every night, the first television war. The images of burning villages, body bags, and traumatized soldiers shattered the post-World War II consensus. A massive anti-war movement rocked the nation, especially on college campuses. The war divided families, communities, and the country itself. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. Over 58,000 Americans had died. Vietnamese casualties, military and civilian, numbered in the millions. It was the first war the United States had unambiguously lost, and its scars on veterans, on policy, on the national psyche endure. Even as America fought for freedom abroad, millions of its own citizens were denied basic rights at home. In the South, Jim Crow laws enforced rigid racial segregation. Black Americans were forced to use separate schools, restaurants, water fountains, restrooms, and bus sections. They were systematically denied the right to vote through poll taxes, literacy tests, and outright intimidation. Lynching, the murder of Black Americans by white mobs, was a tool of terror used with impunity. The modern civil rights movement began in earnest in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The decision overturned the separate but equal doctrine that had been the legal foundation of Jim Crow since 1896. In 1955, Rosa Parks, a seamstress and NAACP activist in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat on a city bus to a white passenger. Her arrest sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, a year-long protest led by a young Baptist minister named Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott succeeded, and King emerged as the most important leader of the civil rights movement. What followed was a decade of sustained, courageous, nonviolent resistance. The sit-ins at segregated lunch counters, the Freedom Riders who challenged segregation on interstate buses, the Birmingham Campaign, where police turned fire hoses and attack dogs on peaceful protesters, including children, the March on Washington in August 1963, where King delivered his transcendent "I Have a Dream" speech before 250,000 people. The violence was relentless. Medgar Evers was assassinated. 4 young girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. Civil rights workers were beaten and murdered across the South, but the movement's moral power was undeniable. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act banned the discriminatory practices that had disenfranchised black voters for decades. The movement was broader than any single leader. Malcolm X articulated a vision of black empowerment and self-defense that challenged King's nonviolent approach. The Black Panther Party demanded economic justice and community control. The struggle encompassed not just legal rights, but economic opportunity, housing, education, and dignity. The decade ended in tragedy. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in November 1963. Malcolm X was shot dead in February 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis in April 1968. Robert F. Kennedy was killed in Los Angeles 2 months later. The leaders were gone. But the movement had changed America irrevocably. The social upheaval of the 1960s rippled outward. The women's liberation movement challenged gender inequality in the workplace, in education, in law, and in the home. The environmental movement, galvanized by Rachel Carson's Times, Silent Spring Times, and the first Earth Day in 1970, led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and landmark legislation like the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. In June 1969, a police raid on the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York City, sparked days of protests and riots. The Stonewall Uprising is widely regarded as the catalyst for the modern LGBTQ+ rights movement. The early 1970s brought another crisis, Watergate. In 1972, operatives connected to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. The subsequent investigation revealed a pattern of corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice that reached the Oval Office. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on the 9th of August 1974, the only U.S. president ever to do so. The scandal deepened public cynicism about government that the Vietnam War had already ignited. The late 1970s and 1980s saw a conservative resurgence. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, championed lower taxes, deregulation, a strong military, and an aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup that put enormous economic pressure on the already struggling Soviet system. Then, with stunning speed, the Cold War ended. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War, which had defined global politics for over 4 decades, consumed trillions of dollars, and brought the world to the edge of destruction, was over. The United States of America stood alone as the world's sole superpower. The 1990s were, for many Americans, a golden age. The Cold War was won. The economy, powered by the technology revolution, surged. The internet transformed communication, commerce, and culture. Silicon Valley became the engine of innovation. Unemployment fell. The stock market soared. The federal government even ran budget surpluses. In foreign affairs, America was the undisputed global leader. The Gulf War of 1991, a swift military campaign to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi invasion, demonstrated American military supremacy. NATO expanded eastward. American culture, movies, music, technology, fast food spread across the globe. But the unipolar moment was fragile. On the morning of the 11th of September 2001, 19 hijackers affiliated with the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda seized 4 commercial airplanes. 2 were flown into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The 4th, United Flight 93, crashed in a field in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. September 11th transformed America. The war on terror reshaped foreign policy, domestic security, and civil liberties. The USA Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers. The Department of Homeland Security was created. A nation that had felt invulnerable suddenly felt exposed. The United States invaded Afghanistan in October 2001, toppling the Taliban regime that had harbored Al-Qaeda. In March 2003, the U.S. invaded Iraq based on claims later proven false that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. The Iraq War would last nearly 9 years, cost over 4,400 American lives and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives, and remains one of the most controversial decisions in modern American history. The war in Afghanistan became America's longest war, ending with a chaotic withdrawal in August 2021. In 2008, the American economy nearly collapsed. The subprime mortgage crisis triggered a financial meltdown that spread worldwide. Banks failed. The stock market plummeted. Millions lost their homes and their jobs. The Great Recession was the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, and it exposed deep structural problems in the American financial system. The federal government intervened with massive bailouts and stimulus spending measures that were necessary but deeply unpopular. That same year, the United States elected its first black president. Barack Obama's victory in November 2008 was a moment of profound symbolic significance. A nation that had enslaved black people, fought a war over that enslavement, and then subjected them to a century of legal segregation, had now chosen a black man to lead it. It was not the end of racism, but it was a milestone that few had imagined possible even a generation earlier. In the years that followed, the divisions within American society deepened. Political polarization reached levels not seen since the Civil War era. The two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, moved further apart ideologically, and the shared assumptions that had once allowed for compromise eroded. Social media amplified outrage, spread misinformation, and sorted Americans into echo chambers. In early 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic struck. Over 1 million Americans would ultimately die, the highest reported toll in the world. The pandemic exposed and exacerbated existing inequalities in healthcare, in wealth, in education, in race. It strained the social fabric and tested the nation's institutions. The murder of George Floyd by a police officer in Minneapolis in May 2020 sparked the largest protest movement in American history. Millions marched in cities and towns across the country and around the world demanding racial justice and an end to police violence against black Americans. The January 6, 2021 attack on the United States Capitol, in which a mob stormed the building in an attempt to overturn the results of the presidential election, was a jarring assault on democratic norms and a stark reminder that the American experiment is not guaranteed to endure. So here we are. In the third decade of the 21st century, the United States of America remains the most powerful nation on earth. Its military is unmatched. Its economy is the largest. Its cultural influence reaches every corner of the globe. Its universities, its technology companies, its scientific institutions set the pace for the world. But power is not permanence. China is rising, the climate is changing. Artificial intelligence is reshaping what it means to work, to create, to be human. And within America itself, the fundamental questions remain unresolved. Who belongs? Who is equal? What does freedom actually mean? The history of the United States is not a simple story of progress. It is a story of contradictions, liberty and slavery, democracy and exclusion, innovation and inequality held together by a single, audacious idea that a nation could be built not on blood or soil or monarchy, but on a set of principles, that people could govern themselves, that rights were not gifts from kings, but birthrights of every human being. Americans have failed to live up to those principles repeatedly, grievously, sometimes unforgivably. But in every generation, people have risen to demand that the nation do better, to insist that the promise be kept, to expand the circle of who counts as we the people. That is the American story. Unfinished, imperfect, still being written. The United States is the most powerful nation on earth today, but for how long? And more importantly, what will it choose to do with that power? That is not a question for history, that is a question for you. If this video made you think, drop your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in American history surprised you the most? And do you think the American experiment can sustain itself in the decades ahead? Let me know. If you learned something new, hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive, and share this with someone who loves history or needs to. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.